The Winter of Red Snow, The Revolutionary War Diary of Abigail Jane Stewart, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 1777. Reading 5. January 3rd, 1778, Saturday. At 6 o'clock this morning we were awakened by a sound of drums and fifes. Papa and I hurried out in the blowing snow to see if there was a battle. Other families met us on the road. We expected to see guns ready, but instead we saw rows of soldiers, all at attention, at the edge of the snowfield. In front were officers on horseback with the drummer boys and fifers. In the center, one horse was being led out of camp. A man without a saddle was sitting backwards so that he faced the soldiers and General Washington. His coat was turned inside out, his hands were tied behind his back, and he hung his head in shame. I leaned onto Papa's arm for warmth. He told me, "That soldier is being drummed out of the army." At supper, Mr. Walker stopped in and told us the man stole $200 from an officer, and now his crime and punishment will be published in all the newspapers. Baths, this week it's my turn to go first. January 4th, 1778, Sunday. A terrible day. On our way home from church, we saw a bare oak tree where soldiers were gathered. A hanging had just taken place, and the body of a poor man was swinging in the wind. The talk we heard along the road was that he had deserted and had been caught running across the ice river. I hated the army. I wished they'd go home. Sally cried and cried the sight. It snowed all day. January 5th, 1778, Monday. Snowed another 6 inches. Papa was using the sleigh to haul a dead horse out of camp. The hide will make some shoes. This is why Elizabeth and I walked to headquarters and carried back the laundry. It was so cold. Not until we'd been by Mama's fire and kettle for nearly an hour did we finally warm up. I have still not met General Washington, although I saw the heel of his boot as he rounded up the stairway. January 6, 1778, Tuesday. Elizabeth and I returned from General's laundry this morning, pressed and folded. There was much busyness. Billy Lee noticed us and finally smiled, taking the bags into his arms, turning for the stairs. As we were leaving, a soldier came in from the snow with a rush of icy air. He looked not at us, but snapped his heels and saluted to an officer standing by the fire. "At ease," said the officer. "Spread word that smallpox inoculations are to begin immediately by order of our commander-in-chief." He explained there would soon be 50 hospitals throughout camp and the countryside. They had started with our little schoolhouse and were going to be taking over some of the barns and meeting houses. "Abby," said Elizabeth when we were on the path outside, "what if they take up our church, and what shall we do then?" "I know not. Every day there are more things to puzzle over." January 7th, 1778, Wednesday. I'm feeling unwell. Papa came in with a hide that smelled so bad it made our eyes sting. He said General Washington had ordered his men to bury the dead horses instead of leaving them where they drop. They are dying of starvation. Papa shook his head. "The ground is frozen," he said. "How shall they do this? I wonder. It is difficult enough to dig their necessaries." January 9th, 1778, Friday. The past 2 days have been above freezing. Snow is melting into mud, making the roads a dreadful mess. Papa's front wheel broke, and when he tried to haul hay to the Potters, Mr. Potter had to repair it. When Papa was returning home, he came across another deserter being hung, a man from Virginia. Colonel DeWeese brought over a cloth full of gingerbread, baked by Mrs. Hughes. He sat down at our bench to drink Mama's raspberry tea, not English tea, and to complain about the soldiers. He discovered 3 of them in his barn stealing hay and lumber. "How shall I feed my horses or mend my roof?" he said, his face in his hands. January 11th, 1778, Sunday. Thankfully, our church has not yet been turned into a hospital. It is snowing again. Johnny is almost 6 weeks old and has not been out of our warm house. I rock him and kiss his tiny fingers every chance I get. "Please, thou must live, Johnny," I say. Before dinner, I was leaning into the hearth and put out the corn cakes when I looked over at him in his cradle. An amazing thing happened. Johnny smiled at me. January 12th, 1778, Monday. Laundry. My hands are raw and peeling at the fingertips. The last few times we've gone to headquarters, General Washington has been sitting at a table writing letters. I've seen only the side of his face. He wears a pigtail with a black satin ribbon tied on the end. I do not think it is a wig, but his hair is powdered. January 13th, 1778, Tuesday. Today, when we returned the laundry, I was astounded to see only General Washington in the parlor, no other officers. I know not where Billy Lee was. The general was sharpening his quill with his penknife. He looked up at us and smiled. His face would have been handsome, I think, if it were not so badly scarred from pox. "Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Elizabeth," he said. I curtsied, unable to speak. How did he know our names? He looked at us with kind eyes. They're gray-blue. When he returned to his pen and paper, "Mrs. Hughes says Mr. Washington writes at least 15 letters a day, mostly to Congress. He is pleading for food, clothing, and other supplies," she told us. January 17th, 1778, Saturday. It has snowed for 7 days with only wind in between, no stars at night, no moon. I abandoned my journal because I have been ill. I cough until my ribs ache, and I have been unable to eat much more than broth. Sally said my neck is as thin as a chicken's. I have not had a bath in 2 weeks. 2 of our pigs are missing. Papa said footprints in the snow were from soldiers. He knew this because of the blood. January 19th, 1778, Monday. Wash day. I burned my hands on one of the irons. We keep 2 in the coals to heat, 1 in use. I was watching Sally sneak a lick from the molasses jug when I ran the iron off General Washington's collar right over my left hand. It hurts, but is only red, not blistered. January 20th, 1778, Tuesday. Sally came screaming that someone ruined her doll. She'd been playing in the barn and left it in the hay overnight, in a safe little house she made. We went to the barn. Someone had slept there and not cleaned up after their necessary. The same person stepped on Sally's doll and tore the dress in half and one arm off. I can sew it back on for her. January 22nd, 1778, Thursday. My cough is better, though I feel weak. Stayed by the fire all day and made onion soup for supper. Mama had asked me to write down instructions, so here they are. To the small pot I added 4 large onions, sliced, 2 quarts of milk, 2 large scoops of butter, salt, and pepper. When it came to a boil, I eased the pot to the side of the coals so it would cook slowly until the onions were soft. In my teacup, I beat 1 egg, spooned a bit of hot soup into it, beaten some more, then poured it back into the pot. Cooked it 10 more minutes or so. This we ate with brown bread and baked apples. Papa is worried soldiers will steal our hens, but the warmest place is in the barn, so we can do nothing to prevent them. He filled a crate with firewood ash and carried it to the cellar. This is where he'd hide the eggs, small end downward, to keep them fresh. We'll turn them endways once a week. January 23rd, 1778, Friday. Sally wanted to bake bread this morning, so I sat in the rocker with Johnny to watch. She tucked her skirt into her leggings to keep the hem from catching fire, then swept a clean spot on the hearth. She took the dough that had risen overnight, set it on the bricks, then covered it with an upside-down kettle, the small one. With the long spoon, she scooped up hot coals on top and all around. The aroma for the next hour was wonderful. Sally was so pleased with herself when Mama served her with the butter for afternoon tea that she announced she's ready to get married. We teased about her sides. She's just 6. Before bed, I brushed her hair into 2 plates. She sleeps between Beth and me now because her trundle is cold and lonesome. We are like 3 cats curled together. January 24th, 1778, Saturday. We woke up to a shock. Our entire north fence is gone, all the rails and posts, all of it. Marks in the snow showed where it had been dragged piece by piece towards the encampment. Papa was so cross his jaw turned stiff. "I'm trying to help the army," he said, "but by God, they are turning my home into firewood." After breakfast, he buttoned his coat and said to Mama, "I shall report this to General Washington." Papa let me ride in the wagon with him. There is not enough snow in the road for sleighs. He took the long way to headquarters around the Stand of the Pines, past Slab Tavern, then by Joseph Mann's cabin. Joseph is a freed Negro like Billy Lee, as he lives on the Valley Creek near where it meets the Schuylkill River. There were sentries with rifles. They were warming themselves over a small fire. Two of the soldiers stood in their hats to keep their bare feet off the snow. At headquarters, we waited outside in the cold. Through one of the windows, we could see General Washington and several officers. A prisoner stood in front of them, hands tied behind his back. Soon he was led outside by the guards. 250 lashes for you, mister, aren't enough, said one soldier to the man. Selling beef to the redcoats should have got you shot, not whipped. That's my opinion. Before we could step into the hallway, another prisoner was led out. He was on his way to 100 lashes for attempted desertion. There were other men inside, handcuffed. Papa walked to the wagon. Some other day, Abigail, he said. These court-martials will take hours. Mrs. Hughes visited with her youngest nephew, who played marbles by the fire while we had tea. She said that soldiers are deserting nearly every day. She knows this because some of the court-martials of those who were caught are taking place in the drawing room at the temporary home, the Dewey's, also at David Stevens' house, where General James Varnum is quartered. I wonder if Mrs. Stevens does General Varnum's laundry. It's the foreign-born mostly, Mrs. Hughes told us. They have not the same loyalty as those of us born here on American soil.